welcome. Halloween. Samhain, the Day of the Dead. All Hallows Eve. Traditionally the night when the restless spirits of the dead rise to walk among us. The ghouls and ghosts and ghastly things that go bump in the night. The terrifying. The sad and the horrifying. A time when the nights draw in close and the candlelight that holds it back flickers and gutters in the wind from beyond the veil. Better not let it go out. A time to gather in the circles of firelight and tell stories. A time to drink and make merry. A time to sing and keep all the fears at bay. So, my lovelies, my pretty ones, take a glass of wine in your hand and let's hear some tales of the beings that might walk out there tonight, up past our little lit up windows. Late one night, a man walked out of a Lancashire pub and into the darkness, into the night, away from the warm hearth and down the long, narrow road toward home. His name was Gabriel. Gabriel was a little tipsy, but braced by the brisk spring air, he walked with a spring in his step and a merry whistle upon his lips. His dog Trot plodded peacefully beside him. A thin crescent moon shone her silvery light down upon the stones of the road and the thick hedges that lined the path. Overhead, trees seemed to arch down, their branches reaching down like plucking fingers, outlined against the night sky. Gabriel walked on heedless. After all, it was a beautiful night for a long walk in the dark. A scream shattered the silence. Gabriel froze, his whistle dying on his lips, and Trot began to whimper. Gabriel roughly told him to be still and walked on, the sound of his own voice bolstering his courage. Further down the road, Gabriel saw someone. Gripping his walking staff tight in his right hand, he walked quickly, easily outpacing the slow, shambling figure. Now closer, Gabriel could see that the figure was in fact a woman. Trot began to bark, and suddenly turned tail and fled, and Gabriel shouted after him to no avail. So he hurried on after the woman. What else could he do? "Where are you going, ma'am?" he asked her. She mumbled something in reply. "I will walk with you," Gabriel said. "It's dangerous to walk alone at night, in the dark." Again, he received only a faint reply. He noticed that the woman had over her arm slung a large cloth-covered basket, and he wondered maybe that was why she was stooping. "May I carry that for you?" he offered solicitously. She handed him the basket, and he held it comfortably in the crook of his arm, for it was not really that heavy. "You're too kind," said the woman gently. But then her voice changed, became harsh and unpleasant, mocking laughter. And Gabriel turned to look at her, but she had turned away and appeared to be staring into the hedge. That mocking laugh came again. It came from the basket. Gabriel froze, and with a great shudder he threw it away from him and into the road. Before his horrified eyes, the basket tumbled to the ground, its white cloth cover flying off, trailing in the dirt, its contents spilling out. A head. Paler than the cloth cover, paler still than the woman's white bonnet, rolled out, its eyes wide and staring, its red gaping mouth laughing horribly. Gabriel turned to stare at his companion. Her bonnet had fallen back to reveal not a face but a bloody stump of a neck where her head had been savagely torn off. Her shoulders shook in silent laughter in time with the head's demonic cackling. Gabriel took to his heels and ran. He gripped his walking staff tight in his hand as he leaped over the basket and took off down the road. Over the blood rushing in his ears, the pounding of his heart, the gasping of his breath in his lungs, he could still hear that dreadful laughter and quick footsteps coming up behind him. Running faster still, Gabriel looked over his shoulder, and there, coming up behind him, was the woman, her own head held in her outstretched arm. And as Gabriel turned back to look at the road ahead, out of the corner of his eye, he caught sight of the woman pulling back her arm for a throw. Gabriel veered off to one side, and the head suddenly flew past him, its eyes wide and staring, its bared teeth snapping and grinding as it landed and bounced on the packed earth of the road where he had been. It reared up and launched itself after him of its own accord, its eyes glittering as it snapped at his ankles. It jumped at him again, and Gabriel was forced to leap to evade its gnashing teeth. Once again it threw itself after him, and Gabriel again was forced to jump, this time much higher, to escape its vicious grin. The head followed him for miles, tangling in his legs, biting at his shins, laughing maniacally and keeping Gabriel dancing all the way. Finally, Gabriel reached the stream that crossed the road near to his house, and he plunged in, sending cold spray up in sheets around him. He climbed up the far bank and ran on. At length, Gabriel realized that the head was no longer snapping at his heels. In fact, he could not even hear its laughter. He dared to look over his shoulder, and the sight he saw lingered with him for the rest of his life. There on the far bank, the headless woman stood, dressed all in white. At her feet rolled and tossed the mad head, caked in dust and mud and snapping like some hellish dog. It was still laughing. Gabriel turned tail and fled, like Trot. Of course, as we all know, there are many evil things in this world that cannot cross running water. Finally, Gabriel burst in through the door of his home to find his wife, soothing Trot, who was still trembling from his fearful encounter with the headless woman. Now, in truth, no one knows how long that woman continued haunting that lonely Lancashire road. In time, the road fell into disuse due to the ghoulish happenings and the steady roll of progress. For all I know, she's there still, lugging her basket up and down that hill, waiting for her next traveller. Of course, not all such creatures wait patiently outside the house. After all, one of the shortest ghost stories is simply, he awoke in the night, alone and afraid, and reached for a match, and a match was put into his hand. Another indoor ghost story begins in an old English country home. A house guest, enjoying a pleasant sojourn in the countryside, was warned by his hostess that the bedchamber he was sleeping in was haunted. He laughed. What foolishness. However, that night as he went to bed, he was gripped by an inexplicable feeling of anxiety. The room was comfortable, well lit, homely. Why should he be afraid? Nonetheless, he looked through every cupboard. He even searched under the bed. Nothing. But that didn't assuage the fear in his belly. So he went further. He looked inside the linen chest and pulled out every drawer and every table. Nothing. So why should he be afraid? Eventually he gave in. After a quick look up and down the hallway, he closed and locked the door, shut and latched every window, pulled the heavy curtains, blew out every single candle save for the one by his bed, and climbed in beneath the sheets. But lying awake, he could hear nothing. Not a whisper, not a rustle. Satisfied, he blew out his last candle and plunged the room into darkness. And there in that darkness, from somewhere near the desk, came a quiet, satisfied voice. Now we're all shut in for the night. Sometimes the terrifying finds us in the most unexpected and mundane places, doesn't it? This next story is actually one I wrote myself. This is about what can happen when you see death staring back at you from your own reflection. It's called Seeing Double. I saw myself on the subway today. As the train rattled to a stop in the dark between stations, waiting for another tube of commuters to pass us by, something made me look up and out into the blackness over the empty seat opposite. In the curved window I caught sight of my reflection, sallow under the stark lights, with deep purple rings thrown into sharp relief under my eyes. The dank, recycled air had flattened my blonde hair to my head and given it a frizzy halo around the edges. No makeup, no coffee, after a long day's work. I examined myself critically and wrinkled my nose in a sneer. Not looking my best. I could barely make out one of the tube's little control boxes outside on the wall of the tunnel, its dim red light flashing above my reflection's right ear. The woman to my left turned the page of her newspaper with a dry hissing sound. The woman 4 seats to my right crossed her legs. She was wearing leopard print leggings. They were distorted in the window, like her heavily shaded eyelids and bright red lips. I surreptitiously glanced at her down the carriage, her large brown hand held tight by the small white fingers of the man next to her. Tattoos snaked up both of their arms, and his face was as colourfully made up as hers, all violent streaks of colour and dark lines. I think I was probably envious of their carelessness. They didn't care that it was dangerous to stand out these days. For them, I guess it was worth the risk. Whereas I couldn't stop the fear. Compulsively checking my reflection in shop windows and mirrors, checking, am I too obvious? Am I nondescript? Do I fade into the background? Do people's eyes slide over me as though I'm not even there? The constant safety checks, chasing themselves around inside my brain like the subway trains on their closed loops. I wondered what we looked like from outside by the control box. A grey, graffiti-ridden coffin filled with grey, graffiti-ridden zombies. And me. Just a beige corpse in a pink cardigan and old grey leggings that had worn out their elasticity. The woman beside me was wearing something so similar I wouldn't be surprised if she'd bought it in the same thrift store. I wondered if everyone else was as scared as I was. If the fear that I felt lay heavily over the city these days permeated their lives as desperately as it did mine. Were they checking mirrors too? Finally, the train shuddered and groaned into motion again, its wheels squealing as the brakes released. I was staring at my reflection again, thinking it was strange how the curved glass made it look like I was 2 feet tall, when I finally realised what my eyes had been telling my brain, what it had refused to hear. My breath went slow, shallow, as I finally looked straight at the reflection of the woman beside me. Her eyes were the same ones I'd seen every day, in all those countless, fruitless mirror checks. The line of her jaw and the creases across her forehead, the small red mole under her left eye, were all terrifyingly familiar. I stared with sick fascination, and that's how I broke the first rule. Don't let them see you've seen. She looked up at me, straight into my eyes, and winked. My heart thudded into my chest, like it was trying to get out, and my whole body slammed back into my seat. I let my face go slack, blank, and stared hard past my reflection and out at the shiny ductwork reflecting the train's lights as we streamed past, trying to shield the way my mind was racing. I caught sight of the leopard print lady looking at my reflection in the carriage. Her brown eyes slid sideways to the reflection beside me, and horrified realisation dawned over her face. She gasped, and her eyes flicked straight ahead, staring dumbly out of the window and squeezing her boyfriend's hand tightly enough that her knuckles popped loudly in the silence. The train made a howling noise as it changed track. The woman's eyes slid inexorably back to mine, like she couldn't help herself, and softened with fear and helpless sympathy as she saw the hopeless desperation in mine. She shook her head slowly and mouthed, "I'm sorry," before determinedly looking away again. My heart pounded so hard I could feel my breath stutter in my lungs. I was alone. I couldn't take it personally. We all knew the rules. Don't stand out. Don't give them a reason to notice you. Kill the second twin. Don't let your children play dress up. Don't let them see you've seen. Don't make contact. Run and be thankful it isn't you. But that didn't stop the forlorn hope pricking at the heart of my despair. Save me, I pleaded. Someone, anyone. Why had it chosen me? What had I done? I'd always been so careful, so diffident, so heartlessly timid and dull. Why hadn't it picked someone braver and more foolish, like the colourful couple down the carriage? Why not them? I hated myself for thinking so cruelly, so selfishly. But when we're afraid, we grasp at anything to convince ourselves that this isn't right. Someone, somewhere made a mistake, but there was no mistake. The reflection was mine, and it knew I knew. Now I only had to wait. It didn't matter where. I could stay on this tube until the end of the line, and ride it all the way back again. Or get up a stop early and walk home through the roughest bit of the estate alone, or go home and sit on the sofa and just wait. It didn't matter. It was coming for me. That is, if the captures didn't get me first. The leopard print woman was staring blankly at her phone. Who knew if she'd raised the alarm already? Signal down there was spotty, but there were always ways to attract their attention. I sat rigidly in my seat, determinedly staring straight at my own eyes and out of the window, as the train moved through the passages, moaning, steadfastly ignoring the taunting gaze of my other reflection. There were no catchers waiting on the next platform at the next station, ready to swarm in and neutralise in their white helmeted uniforms. Just an old man with a beagle. As soon as the doors opened, the leopard print woman and her boyfriend jumped up and hurriedly exited the train. Her head twitched as they stepped onto the platform, like she wanted to look back but caught herself at the last minute. The man with the dog got onto the next carriage. We rattled on past another 3 empty stations, my 2 reflections and I, both of them staring at me while I held the gaze of only one. Finally we reached my stop and I got up, staggering slightly before the weakness in my knees subsided, and walked past the empty seat beside me and out of the train. And now what? My heels click on the tiled floor as I walk away from the platform, filling the bright white pedestrian tunnels with the sharp sound, like scissors snipping. My reflection follows me in the plastic pain-covered billboards, bobbing through advertisements and missing persons posters. In the dull reflection of the white tiles, I see a second shadow keep pace with me. As I reach the terminus, and the row of turnstiles gingerly edges out from behind the corner, I hear the sound of a second pair of heels. Click, 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 click. I don't turn to look around. I swipe my transit card to exit the station and climb the steps to street level. The footsteps follow me. The cool breeze hits my skin and raises goosebumps on my arms. Where shall I go? I look down the road at the park and the row of greasy cafes that lead down toward where there is music, where restaurants and nightclubs huddle together against the cold and dance with light. Is that where I want to go? Do? What do I like to do? It hits me that I've spent so long trying not to be visible to them that I've forgotten what I look like on the inside. I don't know what I like to do. I don't know what I enjoy. Music? Food? Company? I don't even have any friends. The footsteps wait patiently. I turn away from the park and people and walk toward home. I guess I haven't really lived before, so I don't know. Will I miss it? I'll walk more confidently tonight, no longer afraid of what might be in the overwhelming face of what is. At least for just one night, I'm only afraid of one singular shadow. The footsteps sound closer now, more defined, like they have form. I breathe deeply and sigh into the night air, my heart beating in my throat. There is nothing left to fear. It is coming for me. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. That particular story will be available in print form from the 27th of November 2020 as part of my short story collection, Genre Fluid. So you guys are the first to hear about that. 2020. Oh yes. It would seem a cursed year thus far. A year of plague and unrest. Illness, death, destruction. But let us cast our minds back some 700 years. Back to the time of the Black Death. That frightful pandemic of bubonic plague that killed more than a third of both Europe and Asia put together. A time of great fear, famine, war, and horror. Oh yes, it was indeed a time for ghosts. In Hampshire, through the village of Vernham Dean, there runs an ancient Roman road called Chute Causeway. For centuries now, on moonlit nights when all you can hear is the rustle of night creatures and the spine-chilling screech of the owl, the silhouette of a man has been seen, trudging his weary way up that lonely hillside road, his back bent beneath a heavy sack, his arms hung low, dragging great wooden buckets. For centuries, as that man toiled his way up toward the top of that hill, and never once has he reached it. Doomed to start his Sisyphean journey anew with every moonrise. For, once upon a time, back in the year of the plague, that man, a priest, urged his villagers, his flock, to abandon their homes in the village and make camp atop a hillside, that hillside, so that they might isolate themselves and maybe live. He himself, the priest, would stay in the town. He would guard their homes against any thieves or bandits, and he would bring them food and water every day without fail, no matter what. Of course the villagers agreed and made camp atop the hill. But little did they know that the spectre of plague, that burning woman in red, was already among them. One by one, they were struck down. Within days, many had succumbed. And the moans and whimpers of the dying drifted down to the village on the wind, and the priest heard and was afraid. Frightened for his life, he never appeared to his villagers. And so an entire village died, perished, without food or the comfort of even water in their last days, though it had been promised to them. And so, for his cowardice and abandoning the duties of a good shepherd, that priest was cursed to haunt that lonely hillside road for all eternity, staggering under his burden of guilt forever. As we know, 300 years later, the Black Death returned to London. The bubonic plague. The Great Plague this time. And with it came the plague doctors, famous for their beaky masks stuffed with sweet-smelling herbs and spices, desperate to try to lift the curse of the plague. In houses where a victim of the plague had died, they would shut it up, nail it all closed for 40 days, with all the remaining family members still inside, left to die from either the plague or starvation and neglect. A great red bloody cross would be daubed on the door, and beneath it the inscription, "Lord have mercy on us." Of course there were those who found their niche scavenging from the dead. Our man Robinson was one of those. He skulked from house to house, relieving the dead and helpless infected of their valuables and belongings. Even the fine clothes of the dead, even the coins gently placed upon their eyes to hold them shut, were at risk from his thieving hands. Until, a year later, one late September night, a wisp of smoke drifted into the air from a bakery on Pudding Lane and changed everything. Within minutes the blaze roared. The flames, driven by an east wind, consumed most of London. All of the cheek-by-jowl tenement houses and poor houses going up in flames. There were many refugees from the city, and Robinson himself was among them with his cart laden with stolen goods. Robinson returned to his village in the far north of England, but his friends and neighbours, fearful that he had brought the plague with him, drove him out with sticks and stones. And so Robinson took shelter in a barn on the outskirts, and every day sat by the stream, desperately washing his coins, trying to cleanse every last trace of the pestilence from them. In time, Robinson had himself built a great home called Swinstead Hall, and he lived out there for the rest of his life in luxury and died of old age in a soft and comfortable bed. But Robinson's troubles had never left him. And to this day, if you go there, to that stream that still runs by that great imposing house, when the silvery moon peeks out from behind muddy clouds, you will see him. He's still there, sat by the side of that stream, desperately washing his blood-stained coins, trying to clean them of that pestilence. But not all of the spirits in the world are departed souls doomed to wander for eternity. No, some are much older than that, including, of course, Death herself. Known in some Spanish-speaking countries as Santa Muerta, the Lady Death is both a spectral horror and an old friend. Who kinder than to meet you in your final moment and to guide you where you must go? This is a story of a time when Lady Death intervened in the world of the living. Back hundreds of years ago, in arid Spain, Death was kept busy. Plague, bandits, hunger, the predations of Christian inquisitors, the terrible and willful justice of kings, all took their bloody toll. Whether a knife in the marriage bed, an empty belly, a raid on a farmstead, or by the twisted pleasures of the hooded executioners, there was dying aplenty. It seemed that Death herself walked the very roads of the land, her eyeless gaze striking terror into all she passed. Travellers who chanced to meet her on the road would stand aside, eyes closed, praying that she would pass them by. Yet one time, on a dusty road, she did not pass by. She stopped to make an offer. On that same night, a poor farmer, tipsy and full of good cheer, stumbled along the road home. His beloved wife had that day presented him with a son. Drunk on wine and fatherhood, he wandered slowly home, growing deeper in thought with every step. For he was not a rich man. In fact, he had very little, and he knew of few people who would be willing to be godparent to his son. As he walked, he saw a great shining figure striding along the road toward him. He could not fully make out the face, but the stranger seemed to emanate goodness and kindness. He seemed somehow wise and ancient. "My son," said the stranger, "you are looking for a godfather for your son. Who better than God himself?" But the farmer looked warily at God and shook his head. "No, my lord. You permit the cruelties of king and man, the killing in your name without question. You allow poverty. I would not have such a man as the godfather of my son." And on he walked, somewhat more sober. Further down the road, he met another stranger, tall and clad in black, his face also shifting and indistinct, but cunning in appearance. "Good evening, cousin," said the stranger. "You are looking for a godfather for your newborn babe. Who better than the devil himself?" But the farmer looked warily at the devil and shook his head. "No, brother devil. You deceive men such as I, and I could not trust you." And on he walked, a little more sober again. But once again he encountered a stranger walking toward him along the long and winding road home. Now this figure was much clearer, towering in a black robe that swirled around her ankles. Her bone-white face had hollows for eyes and teeth fixed in a permanent grin. "Have you come to take my life?" asked the farmer, shrinking back. "Nay, my friend," Death replied. "I have come to offer to be godmother to your new son." The farmer pondered. Death was as powerful as God, as the devil himself. But though she too was feared and respected by all, no one escaped her incorruptible impartiality. Her judgment was the same for all, in time. And so the farmer looked Death in the eye. "I would be honoured," he said. "My son would be honoured." And he bade her come to the christening. "Let it be tomorrow morning." Death did not offer celebratory words or rejoicing, but stated flatly that the farmer would not regret his decision. Then she vanished into the night. The farmer hurried home along the winding mountain road, Death's hollow voice still ringing in his ears as he told his wife of their son's new godmother. The next morning the whole village had heard, and crowded into the church to see the baptism of this child who would have Death for his godmother. At the appointed hour, Death's gaunt, towering figure appeared in the sunlight at the doorway, a black shadow against the brightness of the day, and walked slowly through the silent, stunned congregation toward the font. She handed the farmer a heavy pouch of gold as a christening gift, and the ceremony began. After the christening had taken place, the farmer tried to invite his son's new godmother to his home, to share in the meagre feast and a cup of wine, but she declined. "My work is not yet done," she said with a hollow laugh, like the cracking of a tomb. I will return when your son reaches 20 years of age, to guide his steps into the world. He will be a great man, and wealthy too if he wills it. She stroked the child's cheek with her bone-white fingers. Then, with a swirl of her great cloak, Saint Death strode down through the village and out of sight. The good folk of the parish all heaved a sigh of relief, for each had been secretly afraid she might have come for something other than the christening. The pouch of gold that Death had gifted brought prosperity and wellness to the farmer's family, and they shared their good fortune liberally with their neighbours and friends over the years. The boy grew up, surrounded by happy people, with enough to eat and sturdy shoes. His family marked his 20th birthday with a feast, and many of the villagers attended, hoping to catch another glimpse of the Lady Death. At the stroke of midday, a cloud covered over the sun, casting shadow over the gathering, and a cold breeze gusted, sending leaves tumbling from the trees. In but a moment it had passed, and there in the midst of the celebration stood Death herself, as tall and gaunt as ever, wrapped in her dark shroud. Her godson bravely stepped up toward her, and she placed her skeletal hands upon his shoulders and looked him up and down. "Happy birthday, my beloved godson," she said in her deep voice. "I wish you joy on this day and always." She told him that he had grown up strong and handsome, and that she was proud of him. Then, denying offers of food and wine, she led him by the hand into the house to sit at the table. When they were alone, she reached into the darkness of her robe and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in fine muslin. When the youth opened it, it contained a strange herb, its flowers pale and wan, its leaves the colour of a deep bruise. Its roots were a mass of dirty white tangles, like reaching fingers. It smelled strange and heady, enticing and relieving at once. He felt somehow more alive just for inhaling that scent. "This is a precious herb," his godmother told him. "It can cure almost any disease or malady. Even the plague that ravaged Spain at that time. Yes, it will cure even that. You must find somewhere to plant it, so it will grow. I will not bring another. You may distill it into tinctures or grind it to powder if you please, but it will work much the same. Merely feed but a small portion of any of the plant, root, flower, leaf, stem, to the afflicted, and they will recover." The boy thanked his godmother, filled with wonder and gratitude. "When you enter a sick room," Death continued, you must look at the bed of the patient, and I will be standing there. No one else will see me, only you. If I stand by the feet, then they may recover with your aid. However, if I stand by the head, you will know they are beyond saving and must be left for me." She spoke firmly. On no account was he to attempt to save someone meant for her. She would not permit him to flout the natural order. Once she was satisfied that her godson understood and would obey, she rose and gently stroked his cheek with those skeletal fingers, and departed. In time, everything Death had said came to pass. The boy planted the herb in a small pot and tended it carefully. He used it to cure a friend racked with fever, an ailing neighbour who had fallen from a tree, even the very priest who had christened him. A merchant passing through town, then another. Soon his fame spread, and people came from far and wide to visit him and receive his healing, carried on litters or in fine coaches. It was not long before his healing hands took him away from his village and out into the world, bringing that strange herb and healing with him wherever he went. He wandered freely, healing lords and peasants alike. No one could understand his astounding talent. He spoke not a word of Greek or Latin or Arabic, and he had not studied with the great masters. But it was undeniable. When he shook his head and declared there was nothing to be done, the sufferer would die within a day. And those he gave salves or tinctures or powders would leap out of bed on the third day as hale and hearty as ever they had been. He became a rich man, accepted as a scholar and the equal of almost any man in Spain. Eventually, tales of his prowess reached royal ears. The king of a nearby country was dying. The physician agreed to come and listened carefully to the words of the men in the country as he travelled through on his way to the palace. He was a just and kind ruler, they whispered. He was merciful. But he had no heir, no son, only a wicked nephew, cruel and corrupt. They feared the wind was about to change in their land. Troubled, the physician arrived at the palace and was greeted by the king's daughter. She begged him with tears in her great eyes, "Please save my father. Though it cost me my life, I would have him well again." She told him that the wicked nephew plotted to marry her as soon as the king was dead to secure his claim to the throne. Taking pity on the princess, on her plight, the physician vowed to do all he could to save her father. However, upon reaching the royal bedchamber, the king lay emaciated and pale, still as a corpse, and the physician saw death standing by his head. Remembering her warning not to flout destiny, he opened his mouth to say that the king was beyond even his arts, but one look at the weeping princess stopped his tongue. He ordered that the king be turned in his bed, so that the head and feet were at different ends, and quickly administered the herb. He will recover, he promised. But when the physician entered the lush rooms that had been prepared for him, death was there waiting. Her face, of course, did not change, but she seemed to glow with rage. The physician fell to his knees and pleaded with his godmother, begging for her forgiveness. He had not saved the king out of selfishness, he said. He had fought against his better judgment out of pity for the princess and fear for the poor folk of the kingdom. After a time, death sighed gustily, the cold wind of the grave, and declared that she would pardon him once, and once only. She knew he had only tried to do what was best. Should he disobey her again, however, she would show neither mercy nor hesitation. Then she left him once more. In 3 days, the king leapt from his bed as hale and hearty as ever he had been, and the kingdom rejoiced. The physician was persuaded to stay, and appointed personal physician to the king, though daily he still ventured forth to cure the sick outside of the palace grounds. In time, the king came to notice the humble love that his physician held for the princess, his daughter, and made it known that he would not stand in their way. After all, what would he not give to the man who had saved his life? The wedding was glorious, full of colour and music, and seemed like all was right and beautiful in the world, for a time. Until one night, a shadow fell over their happiness. The princess fell ill, while her husband was out ministering to the poor folk of the country. She took to her bed. When word reached him, the physician rushed back to the palace, his powders and salve bottles empty. Sick with fear, he burst into her bedchamber, but oh, grief and horror! There by her head stood his cold godmother, gazing eyelessly at him. He whispered to his wife to have no fear, for he would save her. And she smiled wanly at him, trusting completely. In a frenzy, he ordered her turned in her bed and ran to his rooms for the herb. However, when he arrived, death was there already, holding the pot firmly in one skeletal hand. "Please," he said simply. I cannot live without her. I have come to take this back, Death said calmly. You will come with me. Without knowing how, the physician was forced to follow his godmother as she led him swiftly down through the palace and into the underground catacombs beneath. She led him a long way in the dark, until they reached an opening in the walls like a cave mouth, and descended deep into the bowels of the earth. A warm glow lit the walls ahead, and the physician hurried forward, eager to be out of that cold darkness. They entered a vast cavern, bigger than the eye could see, covered all over with lit candles. Death explained that every candle was a human life. The tallest were those of newborn babies, destined to have a long life ahead of them. The shortest were those closest to death, the elderly and the sick. She pointed to one that seemed on the verge of guttering out, little more than a puddle of wax. Beside it stood another, taller candle that still burned brightly. She told him what he already knew in his heart. This candle, flickering near to darkness, is your princess. No power on earth can prevent her death now. This is yours. She gestured to the taller, stronger candle. You say you cannot live without her. I'm sorry to hear it. I do this not in punishment, but as a gift. With one cold breath, like the wind of the grave, Death blew out both candles. The physician fell to the floor. His heart stopped in his chest. Far above, the mournful sound of a bell began to toll. A sad one, then. Of course, death does not come visiting so gently in all of the world. Throughout Northern Europe and the British Isles, he comes riding in a riot of furies. Atop a mighty horse and leading a wild troop of huntsmen through the cold night, he would swoop fiercely down through the world. On nights when silvery clouds obscured the moon, the wild hunt might appear to any foolish enough to be out after dark. They would come galloping as shadows on the wind, pouring out from the netherworld in a great horde with their baying hounds surging at their feet. No one knows the true identity of the leader of the wild hunt. In the north, he is said to be One-Eyed Odin, great father of the Norse, riding with his 2 ravens at his shoulders and swathed in a great blue cloak. Or perhaps Gudrun, the mighty witch. In Wales, the hunter is known as Arawn, the king of the underworld. In England, he is Herne the huntsman, who pays for his sins by riding forever, or perhaps King Arthur. In Devon, he may be Francis Drake, the Queen's pirate. Whoever the leader is, his name is Death. At night, if you heard the sounding of great horns, and the mad laughter of those wild riders, the howling of hounds, you would draw your shutters and withdraw into the small circles of candlelight. On nights such as those, only a fool went walking. There is a tale told in Devon of one such man. A farmer, riding home drunk, late at night after Widdicombe Fair, on a night when the dark clouds scudded across the face of the silvery moon and cast roaming shadows across the dark moors. Wind raged in the trees around him, and lightning forked across the sky, thunder cracked overhead, and the rain began to fall. He soldiered on, his mare carefully picking her way through the mud of the road back to his village. Something moved in the darkness. Something fast and snarling ran past his horse and out of sight. Suddenly the farmer's horse was up to her knees in baying hounds that snapped at her heels and leapt to catch the stirrups in their teeth. He looked up. A dark huntsman sat astride a great black horse in the road before him, with a full sack slung over his saddle, the spoils of the hunt. Distant horns sounded, and snatches of crazed laughter and whooping reached his ears. The huntsman remained still, as his hounds terrorised the farmer's horse. Then, as quickly as they had come, they fled, baying, into the night. The huntsman remained. "Spare a rabbit?" the farmer asked with a drunken grin. The huntsman laughed coldly and reached into his sack. He tossed a limp body to the farmer and wheeled his horse to ride into the night. The farmer peered blearily at the animal in his hands and started violently, almost falling off his horse. In his hands was the spitting image of his youngest son, blue and cold. But when he blinked, his rain-wet hands were empty. He sped home as fast as he could, his mare slipping and sliding in the wet mud of the road. When he reached his home, his wife met him, wailing with grief. Their infant son was cold in her arms. A sad tale, that. An innocent taken by the night. But sometimes the innocent get their revenge. Once upon a time, in medieval Germany, a long winter birthed a rotten summer. The sun grew red and hot, and the corn ripened into the fields into a golden sheet. And all was well, until the rains came. The water came down in sheets, and it battered the crops until the harvest failed and the corn lay rotting and wet on the ground. One village, in the heart of the Rhine Valley, was hit harder than most, and in their desperation the villagers turned their eyes to the richly filled greenhouses, silos, storehouses of Bishop Hatto of Mainz. He was a God-fearing man. Surely he could not countenance letting his people starve, while he himself hoarded such a wealth of grain. The bishop heard their pleas and cries for aid. He idly listened for a week or more as his people grew ever thinner. Then he sent out a herald to the townspeople. "Let all who are poor and hungry come to the bishop's great barn this afternoon. There they will get what they are due." At the appointed time, the people gathered outside the bishop's great barn, women and children with their menfolk and elders, every face as gaunt and drawn as death herself. At a signal, the attendants opened the great barn doors, and the people surged in. But all they saw was chaff and dust stirred by the wind. Then everything went dark. The attendants had swung the great doors to the barn shut. A child wailed in the darkness. Angry voices raised, and the villagers tried to force their way out, but no man among them had the strength or weight to push. A wisp of smoke drifted through the dusty, dark air. And then another sound was heard. The dry crackle of flames in hay, and the spitting as it reached wood. Voices turned to screams, and hands clawed to try and escape, but there was no escape. One by one, the voices fell silent. One by one, the hands went slack. One by one, they succumbed to the fire. In his window, Bishop Hatto sat serenely as his great barn became a funeral pyre for an entire village. He watched as the flames licked the great beams, caught at the thatch until the last glowing timber fell and nothing was left but a great carpet of embers. He sniffed. The country are indebted to me. I have killed the rats that would have only eaten the grain. And that night he had a great feast, and when he went to bed he slept the untroubled sleep of the innocent. The next morning, when Bishop Hatto awoke, he prepared himself to look over the accounts for his estate. But on his way out of his room, something caught his eye, and he stopped. There on the wall, where all of the bishops of Mainz had their portraits, and where his should have been one of them, was an empty frame, with just a tattered piece of canvas fluttering in the wind. Bishop Hatto stepped toward it, and as he did so, 2 rats leapt down and skittered across the hallway out of sight. They had eaten the portrait right out of its frame. As Bishop Hatto stood staring after the rats, a servant ran in. I said, "My lord, your storehouses, the rats, they've eaten all the grain." No sooner had he finished his sentence than a second servant ran in. "Your worship, the rats, they're on the move." Bishop Hatto, feeling a crawling sensation in his skin, ran to the window and threw open the shutters, and he looked out. And there, stretching all the way to the horizon, was a sea of rats, a writhing black carpet of teeth and tails and fur and claws and red eyes, surging towards him. As he watched, they flooded up, covering every stone, every part of the road, all of the walls, the trees, anything that lived, anything that could be eaten was left behind them as bones and dust. They would be there in minutes. So the bishop turned tail and fled. He ran all the way down through a secret passageway that led out from his house down to the docks on the river Rhine. He charged straight down all the way to a boat, shouted at the man, "Row me to this island in the centre of the river." The man, startled, did exactly as he was asked, and rowed his boat across to the little island that sat in the centre of the river, where Bishop Hatto had a small tower that he would go and stay in the summers. No sooner had the boat touched land than the bishop was clawing his way over the rocks, his robes hanging heavily into the water as he scrambled up toward the tower. He ran inside, barred the door, and fled up the spiral staircase, all the way to the highest room. He collapsed on the bed. He must have escaped them. They could not cross the river. They could not get into the tower. But dreadful fascination took him to the window, and his relief was short-lived. He stared out through the window to see his house swarmed over by rats, and they were coming down toward the banks of the river and then plunging in and more on the backs of each other until the whole river was a solid mass of writhing, swimming rats, a bridge with more running across the top. They ran across and flooded the whole island, surrounded his tower, and as Bishop Hatto stared down at the rats stared up at Bishop Hatto. And then almost as one, they started to climb. They ran nimbly, somehow their claws hooking into the smooth stone walls as they spiralled their way up toward the window. First one, then another trickled in. That trickle became a flood. The rats poured into the room, covering the floor, carpeting it, piling rats upon rats until they were 3 deep, until they came up to his knees. He climbed up on the bed to try to avoid them, and they reached the edge of the bed and climbed higher still. And he sat there staring at this great tide of rats, and the rats stared at him. And then they covered him too. In the morning, the rats were gone, and they were never seen again. And Bishop Hatto was found, picked clean to the bone. I think we all know the reason why the rats didn't come back. Their bellies were full at last. Well, I told you, we'd eat a man by the end of the day. I'm sure we could all think of a few people whose faces might do for a Bishop Hatto. I'll leave you to pick which one takes your fancy. I hope you've enjoyed our scary stories and terrifying tales for tonight. Happy Samhain, my friends. Good night.